We're back with another episode of Conversations and Connections. Again, we're the official podcast of the Family Crisis Center of East Texas. I'm Stuart Burson. I'm the prevention coordinator for the agency. And with me today, I have one of our own, Will Windham. He is our BIP coordinator and community educator. We'll talk to him a little bit about what all that means. And Will is also a licensed master social worker. Is that how you say it? Okay. Yes. And Will has been on the show before, and I thought it's been a while since Will has been on here, so I thought we'd revisit and talk about some things that him and I, kind of our professional world revolves around, or at least a lot of it does, and that's the topic of masculinity and healthy masculinity. Will, again, I appreciate you taking some time on this Friday to meet with me.
Yes, good morning. Glad to be back on the Conversations and Connections.
And I think actually a little inside baseball, I think Will was the one that actually came up. We had like some meetings when we were starting the podcast about what to call it, and I think Conversations and Connections was Will's brainchild.
Yeah, perhaps. I can't even remember now. Still waiting on that gift card for the naming rights there.
Okay, right. Your residual checks to come in. There we go. Right, yeah. Will, first of all, again, like I said, we're going to talk about healthy masculinity today and some topics kind of centered around that. So when I say you're the BIP coordinator, would you mind, again, just kind of explain what exactly your position is here at the Family Crisis Center?
Yeah, so BIP stands for Batterers Intervention and Prevention Program, and really what it is it's a Department of Criminal Justice alternative to going to jail. So they can come after they've had some issues with intimate partner violence, domestic violence, and it's just a group for men. So we facilitate that group. We, meet with the men and we put them in that group and coordinate that, and then just work with their probation officers around that. So mostly working with men.
Okay. So on the topic of healthy masculinity, and this is a term that's kind of been thrown around a lot. Healthy masculinity, toxic masculinity, hypermasculinity, things like that. When you talk about healthy masculinity, when that word or that phrase presents itself, what does that mean to you?
I think, we get too carried away by the masculinity at times. Really it's just about being like a healthy human being. But of course, these things that, and I know we're going to get into some of it, that are typical of like men, what of those become unhealthy? The aggression, the over-reliance on, having to have fast cars, going down to the gym and looking a certain way. All that, while not inherently unhealthy, can trend to be that way, right? Yeah. So I think healthy just means that you're aware of yourself. You've got some emotional resilience, I think, which I think just means that when someone makes you really angry, you're capable of handling yourself and sort of coming back to the center. So I think, of course, in our line of work in BIP, healthy masculinity is really defined by what we see as unhealthy, So these guys that are getting angry, they can't control their emotions, they lose control or give it over to someone else. And so really we can define what's unhealthy and then really paints a picture of what then becomes healthy, But I think it really just revolves around, are you physically healthy? Are you mentally healthy? Do you need to talk to someone? Do you have a support system? Things like that.
Well, it's interesting that you said that right there about addressing that. Do you need help? And that's the thing I think a lot of times we run into with the over masculine ideas is that as a man, a lot of us believe we don't need to ask for help, or we shouldn't ask for help, that we need to handle our own issues and problems. And, I'm not going to go to a therapist, because I'm a man, I can handle my own stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's at the center of so many of these problems with men is that you just, you get in this idea in your mind and you never ask anyone else about it. It's like someone presents an idea to you and we just buy it immediately at face value, never ask if it's a good idea or a bad idea. We just accept it. And a lot of that is around those ideas like that.
Right. And I want to also, whenever I'm doing my work and we start talking about masculinity and gender roles, I want to get this right out. Guys, we're not telling you to quit being men. We're not telling you to turn in your man card or anything like that, or necessarily even to soften up. But I think we just need sometimes to take a step back and just kind of examine our attitudes on how our attitudes as men affect others.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as we get down to that, do get some pushback from time to time. But I think really, think about men that get angry about this, you just have to ask them, why? What makes you so angry, right? What is it about these conversations that really push those buttons? And a lot of times it's because the challenging around, why are you so angry, or why? Yeah. Can you only solve conflicts with anger and violence, right? Well, when you confront people like that, it makes them mad. People don't, And so that initial sting is something that you have to sort of get over. That's why BIP is so long. Again, it takes 6 to 8 weeks, I think. If BIP is 24 weeks long. And initially, it's going to take 6 to 8 weeks just to get these guys to understand, build some rapport, get them to sort of trust what you're telling them, because they've got a lifetime of these ingrained negative ideas about manhood. And so, of course, when you bring someone in and say, hey, man, look, I need you to totally rethink what it is that you're going to get some pushback. But the overcorrection, you just have to be a little more curious about why a man would be so angry when you're asking him, hey, man, do you want to be better in your relationships? Would you like to be less anxious, less stressed? Rethink these ideas about what your role is. If you have to be the provider all the time, it creates a lot of stress for you.
Yeah.
And so you just have to rethink some of those ideas. Again, BIP isn't about like changing the wholesale way you think or changing you as a person, but more or less just challenging some of those ideas.
And I would assume it's a challenge for you. I don't think any of these guys are here voluntarily. They're ordered by the courts, I guess, to attend BIP.
Yes.
So it's not like, they wake up and have this epiphany that, hey, I'm going to better myself. I haven't been acting right. I'm going to go do something about this. Yeah. And so I'm sure a lot of these guys are coming here reluctantly because they have to. And that kind of presents a challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I would say 100% of the time men are skeptical of me the first time I see them, absolutely. And it's not personal towards me. It's the system they've been through by the time they get here. And men arrive in different places. Some have had the idea to reflect on what they've done, and they've got some ideas about it. Some people are just still angry.
Yeah.
But, I think the idea that a man will talk to you about these conversations is the start. They come into the group setting where other men talk about these things. So whether they like it or not, they're in a way forced some way to begin to communicate, because otherwise they just wouldn't.
Right. Well, talking about getting back to the idea of healthy masculinity, how does that concept differ from traditional or stereotypical ideas of being a man that many of us grew up with? How, and again, I want to emphasize, we're telling guys quit being guys, but at the same time, what, I guess, our societal influences versus how we need to identify as healthy masculinity.
This makes me think of an activity I saw done once. We've used it from time to time, but not in a formal way, but where they took this group of men and they said, okay, think of the last movie you saw, Hollywood, Marvel, all that. List the traits of the manliest man you've seen recently. Mm-hmm. Right. So we would think about that. So you get this set of traits, he's strong, he looks good, all the women love him, no one ever tells him no. And so we get this list, and then we say, okay, let's put that away, and we're going to spend 5 minutes. Think about the best man that you know right? Your grandfather, your father, the coach. So just a man that had some positive influence on your life, and what are the traits that he exhibits, right? So then you get this list of things like he was loving, he was caring, he was a good provider. So you get these two differing lists, and I think really that starts to shape up what's healthy masculinity and what tends to be risky in the unhealthy way, right? So, but typically this idea of the best man we know are things that are typically unmanly, right? The caring, the compassionate, the patience, and things like that. Typically not what the conversation centers on when we talk about men, but those two lists differ greatly. So I think that's probably closer to healthy masculinity versus what we would define as masculinity. Now, hey, look, Superman, he's not a criminal, but a lot of those things he exhibits, they can be risky, right? If you always think the woman's going to say yes, you're going to have some problems, right?
Right. So when you work with the guys, let's say in BIP or just whenever you're doing other presentations, what are some myths that you have to maybe bust, so to speak, or challenge about masculinity?
Yeah, I think when you think about all these traits, really, it's really ingrained in these men that they have to be the provider. I think they always wear that real heavy on them, like if they lose a job or they can't provide, or perhaps their partner is on them about not being able to provide to the level they think they should. I think that really wears on them. I think really we don't talk a whole lot about it, but we get into like sexual myths, right, which are less talked about, so harder to, I think, maybe adjust. But these ideas that that's the only value that women have, right, is this sexual value. I think that's a huge myth men carry. Of course, society sells them that idea all the time. Right. But yeah, just it's all on them to make things better, right? Mm-hmm. Like if your life, if you've got some depression or mental health issues, you're supposed to fix those, which is kind of asinine because we really, most of these men and even myself have zero skills on how to fix some of those things, but we're out here trying to wing it and do it ourselves, right? Which is a problem.
Yeah. So how can the concept of toxic masculinity and toxic traits harm our relationships with our significant other?
Yeah, I think, again, these toxic masculinity traits, they're not a death sentence, but they are risky, right? So if you, feel like you need to spend all the time with your guy friends drinking while your wife or girlfriend's at home, or maybe your kids are at home, that's going to be unhealthy, right? There's going to become questions about that. If you just feel like as a male you have the right, say, to the cell phone, so you can check that thing all the time, it becomes issues around privacy and stalking. So a lot of these traits, right, if you have to always be in control of things, now that's not going to get you arrested in BIP group, but you're going to have a lot of bickering about, where you're going to eat on Saturday night if you always have to control, the decisions in the family and things like that, which, do all men want to do those things? I'm not sure, but it is part of those masculine traits that are just assigned to men that cause problems, right?
Right. So besides our relationships, how can toxic masculinity harm the man himself?
Yeah, perhaps the most egregious part of all this is that the men we see, they don't ever think about how some of their behaviors harm themselves. Of course, these things, hey, look, the guys we see in BIP, this over-reliance on your manliness and the need to control a situation, well, it got you arrested and put in jail and ultimately in BIP. And while we spend a lot of time looking at how that harms other people, it's a lot for the man, right?
Yep.
You've been put through the ringer by the system. You're depressed. You're explaining you're having trouble working because you've got to be at this BIP group. You've got to pay all these fees. Again, just one of the largest challenges, and it's not easy to do, is to think about how challenge these men to think about how these masculine traits do ultimately harm themselves,
right.
when you're really adhering to them So,
Yeah.
even again, men that run around and have lots of sexual relationships with women, that's really built up in society. But in Bib group, we'll hear those men. They do express just how empty that can feel sometimes. So even those things come out from time to time.
Right. Well, that's good that a lot of these guys will acknowledge.
Yeah,
acknowledge that.
it is.
So let's just hypothetically say a man wants to change his attitude and he wants to embrace the healthy masculine attitude and lifestyle. Where does a guy begin? Where do you start?
Well, that's there's resources everywhere. I think out there. I think where I begin this conversation is to tell men when they ask this, the biggest thing is the willingness, right? Mm-hmm. Like changing your behavior or finding this information is just not rocket science. The hardest part is the doing, right? Mm-hmm. So the willingness to change. If you say to yourself, look, I want to be different, and you're willing to do that, you'll go do a Google search, you'll seek out information. As you know, there's this podcast, there's a ton of podcasts out there, there's YouTube, there unfortunately are not a lot of men's groups around that we know about, right, where you can just pop in and join up a group of men and talk about these things. But yeah, if you were looking for healthy masculinity, I would say just Google it and be open-minded to what you read. You don't have to agree with everything. Perhaps you just hate all of it when you first read it. But if that's the case, again, back to some of those initial questions, you have to ask yourself why it rubs you the wrong way. But yeah, I think if you just have the willingness, that's what it is. In BIP, again, for across 24 weeks, we first spend the first 6 to 8 weeks just trying to sell these guys the idea that, it's okay to change, but no one's going to throw you on the trash heap if you decide to be a better human being as a man.
Right. And, speaking of, I just want to say, if you're listening and you have a men's, if you know of a men's group, if you belong to a men's group, that's part of Will and I's job is to talk, do presentations and talk about these topics. Give us a call. At the end of the podcast, I'll give you our phone number. Give us a call, reach out, and, either Will or myself or both of us would be more than happy to come and talk to your guys.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, if you're starting a man's group or something like that, please let us know where you are and where you meet so we can send the folks we see there. Yeah. It's an absolute need.
And even boys also, I want to, make it clear, we're not just necessarily doing these presentations and covering this topic to men. We're also young men and boys in school age, where their concepts of what being a man is are being formed. That's probably one of the best times to start talking to them about healthy masculinity. Do you face resistance? And I know you kind of touched on this, and I can kind of agree probably with what you're going to say. When you talk about healthy masculinity and how to kind of turn toxic masculinity around, do you ever face resistance when you talk about that to guys?
Yeah, I think the first thing is that it's hard to talk about unless you're given like the floor to speak about it, right? So again, I like to tell the story in the group from time to time when they are thinking about, really down on themselves about how hard it is to have these conversations or talk to us. Like, if I'm standing around with a group of guys on a Friday night, we're having an adult beverage, hey, I was out in the oil field this week and it was rough, a lot of work, and I did this manual labor, and I work in construction, or this guy works over here in business or something. Well, you get a lot of side eyes when you're like, hey, yeah, the social work BIP group was great this week. You know what I mean? So I think still just not wholly understood. I think men aren't opposed to having these conversations. It's just not socially okay. Now, I don't get punched in the face if and I think that's the worry of most men, so we joke like that. Like if you just ask some guy, I think the belief is that if you say, put your arm around a guy and say, hey man, are you all right? He's going to punch you in the face, right? Yeah. Well, he may look at you funny up front, but I've never been physically abused.
Yeah, right.
And so I think it's a shock initially, but I think men now are more willing to talk about it. They're just unsure how safe it is. And then, of course, this one tenet of manhood that just hovers over everything is this idea that if I'm vulnerable or share something with you, you'll use it against me, right? And that is one of the two probably main things that really drive a lot of male behavior, I feel like. Like, I just can't tell my partner anything that would be hurtful because I just believe they'll use it against me in the future.
Right.
And that's pervasive.
Well, and that kind of goes with, sometimes I'll use this example. A kid on the playground that gets hurt and wants to start crying, they have that thought, man, my buddies better not see me bawling or I'm going to catch it, Or, yeah, me and my wife, we watched The Notebook last night. Man, that brought me to tears. But, man, I can't tell my bros that, though, because that's going to make me look weak.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I mean, we don't talk about it enough here, but this idea, another one of the major things is this idea that men are constantly having to prove that they're not gay, right, which goes into this whole LGBTQ issues. And men won't say it enough. But, yeah, it starts so early. And it starts, in third grade on the playground. These guys are just constantly having to prove this manhood, which is some of the issue. Right?
Yeah, sure. What do you say to someone who feel that talking about this is an attack on men? A lot of times, and it's not just talking about healthy masculinity, it's talking about a lot of the other topics, consent, sexting, and things like that I talk about. A lot of times I feel like I do need to preface my presentations with, look, we're not male bashing here with what we're going to be talking about. But what do you say to someone who feels like that we are male bashing when we say some of these things?
I always think that it's real interesting that someone would go directly there. Are they offended? Or some of the things we're talking about, some of the things they do. So it's a defense mechanism. You know what I mean? But really, if someone was real fired up, I would just ask them to take a deep breath and tell, hey, look, I'm not trying to change you. I just want you to consider something. Can I ask you a question about the way you feel about something and go from there? Or, perhaps I would just say, what makes you so angry about these topics? And hey, if they could answer, it would be some information for us to understand, better understand. But I think what it does is it just rubs up against those classical values of manhood. We're threatening their position, threatening that power and control that they may have. The saying that, those with the least power abuse it the most, So I think that, if we consider perhaps a male, the only power and control he has in his immediate world is with his female partner. And he controls her, he's abusive towards her. And the second we begin to call that out, become very defensive, right? Because again, not about his relationship necessarily as it is about the way he uses the power and control in his world, right? Which is the tenets of domestic violence here.
All right. Okay. All right. Will Windham, thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Taking some time. And Will and I, we do a lot. In fact, Will and I are officed together. We share the hallway here at the Family Crisis Center. So we're in communication together all the time. And again, if you feel like you need our services, or if you want some more information on BIP or the services that we can provide as far as even prevention work, and talk to your men's group, or even ladies also, give us a call. Our toll-free hotline is 1-800-828-7233. And be sure to subscribe to Conversations and Connections. You can do that via Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, pretty much any podcast service of your choice. Remember, be the voice, if not for you, for someone else.